year was 1849, and the air in Kansas carried a strange weight, as though the land itself was hiding secrets it refused to let go. Travelers moved across the lonely roads, searching for fortune, for a new life, for a place to belong. And along one desolate path stood a small wooden inn, its windows dark, its silence almost too perfect. It was here, at the edge of nowhere, that people came seeking shelter. And it was here that many of them were never seen again. Her name was Kate Bender. To some, she was a gifted psychic, a woman who claimed she could see into the realm of spirits and speak with the dead. To others, she was an enchantress, beautiful, mysterious, and dangerous in ways no one could yet understand. Her dark hair framed a pale face, and her deep, unblinking eyes seemed to hold an unnatural calm, as if she could see straight through a person's soul. She had a soft voice, one that carried a strange comfort, pulling people in, making them feel safe. But behind that comfort lived something much darker. Kate lived with her family, Ma Bender, Pa Bender, and her brother John Jr. They called themselves simple settlers, owners of a small roadside inn where weary travelers could find food, shelter, and if they wished, answers to their deepest fears. Kate was the heart of the place. She claimed to possess psychic visions, offering spiritual readings and seances to those who carried grief, guilt, or secrets they couldn't share. Her reputation spread quickly, and soon travelers would stop at the inn not only to rest but to seek the psychic who could speak to the dead, and Kate played her part perfectly. By the dim glow of candlelight, she would sit across from her guests at a small wooden table, her delicate hands folded over theirs. She would close her eyes and whisper in a language no one recognized, her voice trembling as though channeling something from another world. Then, with perfect precision, she would deliver revelations no stranger could possibly know, details about lost loves, hidden sins, and long-forgotten regrets. Her guests would leave those seances shaken, convinced they had touched the other side. What they didn't know was that Kate was touching something else entirely. Their fears, their weaknesses, their deepest vulnerabilities. Once she understood them, she owned them. On quiet nights when the wind howled across the Kansas plains and the inn creaked under the weight of silence, travelers gathered around the dining table. Kate would pour them wine, leaning close, letting her voice soothe and her laughter charm. Her brother John Jr. would join in, entertaining guests with strange, unsettling jokes that made some uneasy but kept others distracted. Pa Bender, an imposing figure with cold, piercing eyes, said little. Ma Bender, stern and sharp, seemed to watch everything, as though weighing each guest's worth. But the table itself, the table was the trap. Beneath the floorboards, hidden behind a thin curtain at the back of the inn, was a secret. A place where whispers turned to screams, and where the warm glow of hospitality gave way to something monstrous. The Benders had built their inn with purpose, and every traveler who crossed their threshold became part of a silent game they didn't know they were playing. Kate's psychic reading served more than one purpose. As she leaned in close, whispering visions of dead relatives or promises of good fortune, she learned who her guests were, what they carried, what they valued, and most importantly, how much money they had. Her charm made them stay longer, made them trust her, and made them lower their guard. And when the time came, when the fire burned low and the room grew quiet, the guests would sit exactly where Kate wanted them. That was when the family would strike. No one could have imagined it then. To the passing traveler, the inn was a blessing, a rare refuge in an unforgiving land. But to those who entered, it was a place where choices were made for them long before they sat down at the table. And always it was Kate who began the ritual. She would smile, soft and sweet, her eyes locking onto theirs as though she carried some ancient knowledge. Her voice would lower to a near whisper, hypnotic and comforting. "Stay the night," she would say. "The roads are dangerous after dark. Rest here. You're safe with us." Safe. That was the lie they all believed. Outside, the Kansas wind carried the scent of dust and wild grass, but inside the inn the air was thick with something else. Something you couldn't see but could feel, deep in your bones. Some travelers sensed it immediately, an unease they couldn't explain, but by then it was too late. Kate had a way of disarming suspicion, turning fear into trust with a single smile. For those who hesitated, she would offer another reading, convincing them that their fate was tied to the inn, that destiny had led them there for a reason, and many believed her. The first screams came months later, but they were far away. Whispers carried from neighboring towns. A merchant was missing. A doctor vanished along the road. A young couple was last seen heading west, passing the Bender Inn, but no one questioned Kate. How could they? She was beautiful, intelligent, and soft-spoken. She looked like salvation, not death. That illusion made her unstoppable. On a cold, spring night in 1849, a man traveling alone stopped at the inn. He was tired, hungry, and grateful for the warmth of the Bender family's table. Kate sat across from him, her hands folded gently, her gaze fixed on his. She asked him about his journey, about the family he'd left behind, and whether he believed in fate. Her voice, calm and melodic, lulled him into trust. He didn't see Pa Bender's shadow move behind him. He didn't hear Ma Bender's sharp intake of breath. He didn't notice John Jr. placing his hand near the edge of the curtain. He only saw Kate, her eyes like mirrors reflecting every secret he'd buried deep inside. By the time he realized something was wrong, it was already too late. The roads would not see him again. Outside, the prairie stretched endlessly beneath a darkening sky, but inside the inn, silence swallowed everything. The only sound was the faint creak of wood as Kate rose from her chair, her expression unreadable, her steps unhurried. Somewhere deep within her, there was no guilt, no hesitation, no remorse. To Kate Bender, death was not an ending. It was simply part of the design, and yet no one in town suspected a thing. Travelers came and went. Some never arrived at their destinations, but no one connected the dots. The Benders smiled, offered food, shelter, and spiritual guidance, and their reputation as generous hosts only grew. Kate's psychic abilities drew in even more victims, her readings pulling strangers deeper into her web. But whispers were starting to spread. Not loud enough to cause panic, not yet, but soft enough to plant doubt. Something about the Bender Inn felt wrong. Some said Kate's powers weren't from God at all. Others said the family had secrets buried beneath the soil. They were closer to the truth than they realized. The days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, and the Bender Inn became a familiar name among travelers moving westward. To those who passed through, it was a safe haven, a modest wooden house standing against the vast emptiness of the Kansas plains, a place where warm food and strange stories awaited. But to those who never returned, it was the last doorway they would ever walk through. The Bender family played their roles with chilling perfection. Pa Bender, tall and broad-shouldered, carried himself with the quiet authority of a man used to controlling his surroundings. His piercing blue eyes seemed to watch everything and everyone without a word. Ma Bender was colder, her lined face stern and unreadable, her sharp gaze cutting through every false smile and nervous glance. Then there was John Jr., awkward but cunning, whose unsettling laughter made strangers uncomfortable without them knowing why. And at the center of them all stood Kate, beautiful, magnetic, and dangerous in ways no one imagined. Kate was the key. Without her, the inn would have been just another roadside shelter. But her presence gave it something else entirely: allure, mystery, and trust. Her reputation as a psychic spread fast, carried by whispers from town to town. Travelers came, seeking more than rest. They came for answers. Some wanted to speak to loved ones lost on the trail. Others wanted guidance about their fortunes, their crops, their marriages, and Kate gave them exactly what they came for. But Kate didn't just see their futures. She studied them. Every glance, every hesitation, every nervous shift of the hands. She read them all like pages in a book. When a wealthy trader stopped for the night, Kate's soft voice pulled him deeper into conversation. She asked simple questions that felt harmless. Where he came from, who was waiting for him back, home, how far he'd traveled. But with every answer, Kate built a map of his life inside her mind. Where his gold might be hidden, what he valued, and what leverage she had if he grew suspicious. She made her guests feel chosen, special, understood. And when they finally believed her, when they trusted her completely, that was when the family's plan quietly began. At first, it was subtle. A missing traveler here, another there. Families waited for letters that never came. Merchants never returned to their roots. No one thought much of it. After all, the frontier was dangerous and roads were unforgiving. But the disappearances kept stacking up, like shadows lengthening at sunset, until rumors began to form. People whispered about thieves, bandits, and accidents, never suspecting that the danger was sitting right across the table from them, smiling softly in the candlelight. Inside the inn, the Benders perfected their routine. A single long wooden table sat at the center of the main room, placed carefully over a trapdoor hidden beneath the floorboards. Behind a thin curtain at the far wall, another small room waited, cold, silent, and stained with secrets no one could wash away. Guests who entered the inn never noticed the details. They didn't see the faint marks on the wood where chairs had been scraped into precise positions. They didn't notice how Kate always encouraged them to sit in the same place, directly over the trapdoor. They didn't see John Jr. moving quietly, behind the curtain, holding an axe slick with oil to silence its creak. And they didn't see Pa Bender, standing just out of sight, his heavy boots planted firmly in the shadows, waiting for Kate's signal. The family didn't kill impulsively. They were deliberate, calculated. They chose their victims carefully. Wealthy travelers carrying cash or valuables, people who could vanish without drawing immediate suspicion. Kate would spend hours with them, softening their nerves, offering readings, pretending to channel spirits whispering from beyond. The longer they stayed, the deeper she pulled them into her illusion. By nightfall, when the fire burned low and the air grew heavy with exhaustion, Kate would pour the wine. She'd lean close, her voice a soft hum, her laughter warm and inviting. Guests relaxed, their guards slipped. And when she was certain they were ready, she'd give the smallest nod, almost imperceptible, a flicker of movement meant only for her family to see. That was when the curtain stirred. John Jr. would step. Out first, quiet as breath, his shadow long against the dim candlelight. Pa Bender followed, his hand tightening around the worn handle of a hammer or an axe. Kate kept her eyes locked on her guest, holding their attention, smiling as though nothing was wrong. Her calmness was the final trap, her beauty the final weapon, and then it was over. The sound came quick, a dull, brutal thud, followed by silence so heavy it swallowed the entire room. The bodies were dragged behind the curtain, their pockets emptied, their belongings sorted with cold efficiency. Ma Bender worked with mechanical precision, stripping away anything of value while John Jr. wiped the blood from the floorboards. And Kate would sit quietly at the table, her breathing steady, her expression unchanged. For her, there was no fear, no hesitation, no remorse. Outside, the prairie remained silent, the stars scattered across a moonless sky. Travelers passed, along the road, unaware of the graves slowly filling beneath the soil behind the inn. Some nights, Kate would stand at the back of the property, staring out into the darkness where the fresh earth still carried the scent of death. The wind whispered across the grass, and for a moment, it almost seemed like the land itself was keeping their secret. But secrets like these never stay buried forever. By the end of that year, word was spreading faster. A doctor had gone missing, a respected man whose absence raised questions. A young woman and her child vanished, last seen heading west along the road past the inn. Local townsfolk started to notice patterns they hadn't seen before. Too many travelers were disappearing on the same stretch of land, and yet no one suspected the Benders. Kate kept up appearances perfectly. In town, she was charming and graceful, her calm voice reassuring anyone who came close. She offered free readings to those who couldn't pay, building goodwill and trust. She played the role of the innocent psychic so convincingly that when whispers of danger reached the town, people dismissed them. But beneath that facade, the family was growing bolder. The graves behind the inn multiplied. The curtain grew heavier, with secrets, and Kate's reputation as a psychic, once her lure, was becoming her shield. People came willingly, even eagerly, never knowing that they were walking into the hands of death itself. Somewhere deep inside, Kate seemed untouchable, as though she believed she was protected by something beyond this world. Maybe she thought fate was on her side. Maybe she believed her visions made her more than human. Or maybe she simply didn't care. But every predator leaves a trail, and for the Benders, that trail was about to lead straight back to their door. The Bender Inn had become more than a shelter on the Kansas plains. It had become a stage, and Kate Bender was the star. Every guest who walked through the door carried a story, a weight, a fear, a longing, and Kate knew how to turn each one into a weapon. Her psychic readings weren't just entertainment. They were traps carefully designed to unravel the minds of her victims long before her family struck. She studied people the way a predator studies prey. When a guest arrived, Kate's first instinct wasn't kindness, but calculation. She watched everything. The way they moved, how tightly they held their satchels, the tone of their voice when they ordered a meal. Even the smallest detail became valuable. She could tell who carried money by the quality of their boots, who was running from something by the nervous flicker of their eyes, and who would be missed if they never made it home. But she didn't strike right away. That was her genius. Kate understood that fear controlled people, but trust controlled them even more. So she built trust first, slowly and deliberately, weaving her illusion with soft words and a gentle smile. Her psychic abilities were her greatest weapon. She claimed to see visions others could not, speaking with spirits that whispered truths no mortal could know. And she had perfected the art of making those truths feel personal. On cold nights, when travelers gathered by the fire, Kate would lower her voice and lean close, her candle-lit face glowing softly in the dark. "I can see things others cannot," she would whisper, her fingers brushing lightly across the table. "I see someone following you, a man with dark eyes. He's watching your every step." The guest would freeze, his chest tightening, his heart pounding in his ears. How could she know? Kate would tilt her head, her gaze deep and unblinking, as though listening to a voice only she could hear. Then she'd speak again, softer this time. "He says you must be careful. The spirits warn me of danger on the road." Her words were never random. She tailored them perfectly to each guest, feeding into their fears, their doubts, their desires. If someone was mourning, she claimed to hear whispers from the lost. If someone was running from debt, she spoke of pursuers. If someone sought fortune, she promised visions of gold and success. Each revelation pulled her guests deeper into her web, stripping away their defenses piece by piece, and when they believed her, when they trusted her completely, Kate would offer the final nudge. "You should stay here tonight," she'd say, softly, her voice dripping with reassurance. "The roads aren't safe. Rest. The spirits will protect you within these walls." Most never questioned her. They stayed. They drank the wine she poured. They waited for the danger she had warned them about, never realizing it was already sitting across the table. Kate's manipulation went beyond words. It was an experience, carefully crafted from the moment a guest walked in. The lighting in the inn was always dim, the shadows deep enough to make the room feel safe but intimate. The crackle of the fireplace filled the silence, and the faint smell of herbs and incense drifted from the small wooden bowls Kate kept by her readings table. Everything was designed to disarm, to relax, to lure them into vulnerability. Even John Jr., strange and unsettling as he was, played his role well. His awkward jokes and clumsy laughter made him seem harmless, almost pitiable, distracting guests from seeing the calculation behind his wide-eyed stare. Pa Bender stayed in the background, silent and strong, giving the illusion of stability. Ma Bender, cold and sharp, spoke little but always watched, calculating every move alongside Kate. The entire family was a machine, and Kate was the heart that kept it moving. One night, a young widow named Sarah stopped at the inn with her two small children. She carried only a small satchel and wore a simple dress, but Kate saw the weight she carried, not in her hands but in her eyes. Loss clung to her like a shadow. At dinner, Kate sat close and spoke softly, asking gentle questions, offering quiet comfort. She mentioned her gift only after Sarah brought up her late husband. I sometimes feel him near," Sarah admitted, her voice breaking. Kate reached across the table, taking her trembling hands into her own, her eyes glimmering in the firelight. "He is here," Kate whispered, her voice smooth as silk. "He stands behind you, watching over you. He says he forgives you for leaving him." Sarah's breath caught, tears spilling down her cheeks. Her children clung to her dress, confused and frightened. But Kate's tone was steady, soothing, relentless. By the end of the night, Sarah believed everything Kate said. She stayed in the inn, trusting the woman who claimed to connect her to the man she had loved and lost. Neither Sarah nor her children ever left. Kate knew exactly what she was doing, but she hid her cruelty beneath compassion so perfectly that even the most cautious traveler felt safe. She had no remorse, no hesitation, no shadow of guilt. To her, these were not people. They were opportunities, pieces in a game she controlled. And yet, as more and more travelers vanished, whispers in town grew louder. Merchants murmured about missing shipments. Families worried when letters from their loved ones stopped coming. Some locals avoided the Bender Inn entirely, claiming there was something unnatural about the place. But others, especially those desperate for guidance or hope, came anyway, drawn by Kate's reputation as a psychic who could speak with the dead. Every séance was a performance. Kate's voice would drop to a low, trembling tone as she summoned spirits. She'd close her eyes, her breathing shallow, her fingers tightening around her guests' hands. Sometimes she'd shake, whispering words no one understood, until suddenly she'd gasp, as if possessed by some unseen force. Then, with perfect precision, she'd reveal secrets she shouldn't possibly know. The effect was devastating. Hardened men broke into tears, women clutched her hands, begging for more. They believed her completely, never realizing that Kate had been extracting information from them since the moment they walked through her door, and when they trusted her, they were already dead. One evening, a wealthy cattle trader arrived carrying a leather pouch heavy with coins. Kate spotted it instantly. Over dinner, she charmed him effortlessly, laughing softly at his stories, refilling his glass until the wine blurred his thoughts. As the firelight danced in her eyes, she leaned closer and whispered, "I see danger ahead for you, but it can be avoided." He frowned, intrigued. "How?" "Stay here," she said, her voice almost hypnotic. "The spirits say this inn is your protection. One night under this roof, and your fate will change." By the time the moon hung high above the plains, the cattle trader was sitting exactly where Kate wanted him, his chair placed carefully over the hidden trapdoor, his glass refilled once more, his trust absolute. When Kate gave the signal, it was already too late. Behind the curtain, John Jr. moved into position, his shadow flickering. Against the wall, Pa Bender tightened his grip on the hammer. Ma Bender stood waiting, her face blank, unfeeling. Kate smiled softly, her hand resting on the table as if nothing unusual was happening at all. The blow came quick, silent, and final. The trader's pouch was emptied, his body dragged behind the curtain, his name forgotten as though he had never existed. Another shallow grave was dug beneath the prairie grass, one more secret hidden in the earth. And yet, Kate's confidence only grew. Each successful deception, each carefully orchestrated murder made her feel untouchable, as though fate itself was on her side. She believed her psychic gift gave her power not only over the living, but over death itself. But power always leaves traces. And while Kate didn't yet know it, those traces were beginning to form a trail of blood, gold, and missing names that would eventually lead straight back to her door. For now, though, the Bender Inn remained quiet, warm and inviting, a beacon of safety on an unforgiving road. Travelers still came, still trusted, still sat at the table under the soft glow of candlelight, and Kate Bender, the psychic with the velvet voice and unblinking gaze, kept smiling, kept whispering, kept killing. The prairie nights were silent, but inside the Bender Inn, silence carried a different weight. It wasn't peace. It wasn't comfort. It was something heavier, the kind of silence that follows after the last breath leaves a room. By now, the Bender family had perfected their method. Every movement, every word, every glance between them was part of an unspoken ritual. The Yai Inn had been built with purpose, designed as both a sanctuary and a snare. The long wooden table in the center of the main room wasn't just furniture. It was the stage upon which life and death played out. And beneath it lay the secret. The trapdoor, few ever noticed it. It blended perfectly into the wood, worn smooth and hidden in plain sight. The chosen chair, Kate's chair for her guests, was always positioned directly over the door. It was no accident. From there, the victim sat facing Kate, her hypnotic eyes locking onto theirs, keeping their attention fixed while the real danger moved behind them. Behind the thin curtain hung at the far end of the room was the killing chamber. It was small and dark, lit only by a single oil lamp, its shadows stretching long across the floor. The earth beneath was stained and uneven, carrying the faint metallic scent of old blood. This was where the Benders dragged the bodies after the deed was done. It always started the same way. Kate would draw her guests in with soft words and delicate touches, her psychic readings weaving visions of hope, redemption, or warning, whatever they needed to hear. She made them believe she understood them better than anyone else in the world. By the time the meal was served, they were relaxed, drinking the wine she poured, laughing at her gentle jokes. The fire burned low, shadows deepened, and the warmth of safety dulled their instincts. And then, with the smallest nod from Kate, the ritual began. John Jr. would slip behind the curtain first, his movements silent and deliberate. He kept his breathing shallow, his hand tightening around the worn handle of the axe. Pa Bender followed, boots planted firmly, his bulk a looming silhouette in the dim light. Ma Bender waited nearby, her cold eyes fixed on Kate, ready to strip the bodies. Once the work was done, Kate never broke her gaze from her guest. That was her role. The distraction, the hypnotist, the last friendly face they would ever see. When the signal came, it was swift. A dull, heavy sound cracked through the stillness, followed by a brief, strangled gasp. The victim would slump forward over the table, their glass tipping, spilling wine that bled across the wood like a final warning. In one smooth motion, John Jr. and Pa Bender dragged the body through the curtain and down the short steps into the small, cold chamber below. The trap door creaked shut. Kate would sit there, her breathing steady, her expression unreadable, waiting until the silence returned. And when it did, she'd rise slowly, gathering the belongings left behind with methodical precision. To her, there was nothing extraordinary about what had just happened. This was not chaos. It was order. Inside the chamber, Ma Bender worked with chilling efficiency. She'd strip away valuables, purses, jewelry, boots worth reselling. John Jr. dug shallow graves in the darkness behind the inn, his shovel biting into the earth, sweat rolling down his neck under the weight of silence. Sometimes they buried the bodies. Other times, when the ground grew too crowded, they dragged them deeper into the prairie grass, where the wind would erase the last traces of disturbed soil. Night after night, the ritual repeated. Each victim a shadow swallowed whole by the prairie. But the inn itself began to change. Despite their efforts to clean, the faint copper tang of blood lingered in the air, clinging to the walls and floors. No matter how many times Ma Bender scrubbed the boards, faint stains remained, dark smudges that never fully disappeared. Some guests noticed it, their instincts whispering warnings they couldn't quite name. A few even left suddenly, uneasy without knowing why. But most stayed, comforted by Kate's soft voice, her warm smile, her promise that they were safe. Safe. Always safe. One evening, a preacher stopped by the inn on his way west. He carried little more than a Bible and a travel bag, but he had sharp eyes that missed nothing. During dinner, he watched the family closely, his gaze lingering on the way Kate guided him to a very specific chair. His fingers brushed against the wood beneath him, feeling the faint seams of the hidden trapdoor. Kate noticed his hesitation immediately. Her smile widened, soft and calming, as though she sensed his doubts without needing him to speak. "You seem troubled, sir," she whispered, leaning just close enough to make her presence feel intimate. "The spirits are restless tonight. Perhaps you would like a reading." The preacher declined politely, his voice steady, but his eyes scanned the room again. He noticed the curtain, the slight disturbance in the dust beneath it, the faint smell of something metallic in the air. His unease grew, but Kate didn't press him. Instead, she shifted her tactics. She spoke of salvation, of fate, of God's plans, wrapping her words around him like silk, matching his faith with carefully chosen language meant to lower his guard. It almost worked. Almost. But the preacher left before nightfall. For the first time in months, a guest slipped through the Bender's hands. Kate watched him go, her face calm but her thoughts racing. He had seen too much, felt too much. She knew, instinctively, that men like him carried warnings back to towns, planting seeds of suspicion that could grow quickly. From that night forward, Kate became even more careful. Her readings became longer, more personal, more intimate. She learned to dig deeper into her guests' fears and desires, using their own secrets against them to build absolute trust. If someone mentioned family, she heard messages from the dead. If someone feared illness, she saw visions of healing. Every word, every movement, every carefully crafted pause drew them further into her control. The Bender family adapted too. Pa Bender reinforced the trapdoor, sanding the edges smooth so no wandering hands could detect it. John Jr. greased the hinges to silence their creaks. Ma Bender stitched thicker curtains to hide the bloodstains better. Together they made the inn seem harmless, cozy, warm, inviting. But beneath the surface, death lurked in every shadow. Sometimes when the prairie wind howled outside and the fire burned low, travelers heard strange noises deep in the night. Soft thuds, muffled scraping, whispers that carried through the floorboards. They told themselves it was the wind, the shifting of the wood, the sounds of an old house settling. Kate encouraged that belief, her gentle laugh dissolving their doubts like sugar in warm tea. And so they stayed. As the months passed, more graves filled the earth behind the inn, the prairie swallowing names and faces no one would remember. Dozens disappeared without a trace, their families left with nothing but questions that had no answers, but secrets, no matter how carefully buried, leave echoes. Sometimes a bloodstain escaped notice and clung stubbornly to the wood. Sometimes a forgotten trinket, a ring, a locket, a carved pipe, turned up in town, traced back to someone who had vanished along the road. And sometimes whispers reached the wrong ears, sparking curiosity where there should have been silence. The Benders didn't see it yet, but the walls were closing in. For now, though, the inn remained open. The table remained set. The trapdoor remained hidden beneath its smooth, worn planks. And Kate Bender, calm and beautiful, sat across from her next guest, her fingers resting lightly against his hand, her gaze unblinking, her voice soft as velvet. "Stay the night," she whispered. "The roads are dangerous after dark." And as always, he believed her. The prairie roads had grown quiet. Travelers who once rode west in steady streams now paused before entering Labette County, their voices low, their questions cautious. Word was spreading, carried from one inn to another, whispered over fires and through saloon doors. People were disappearing along the trail. Merchants, preachers, trappers, whole families, gone. At first, no one connected the vanishings. The frontier was harsh, the roads unforgiving, people died often and without warning. But the pattern became harder to ignore. It was always the same stretch of land, always near the Bender Inn. Inside the inn, Kate Bender poured wine for a new guest, her face lit by the flicker of the fire. Her voice was soft, melodic, weaving comfort and trust into every syllable. Across the table sat a man in his 40s, his clothes worn from travel, his eyes carrying the fatigue of endless roads. He had introduced himself as William Stenson, a prospector heading west in search of silver. "You've chosen the right path," Kate whispered, holding his gaze as though reading something unseen behind his eyes. "The spirits tell me great. Fortune waits for you, but only if you make the right choices." William leaned forward, caught in her rhythm, his doubts fading under the warmth of her words. She told him what he wanted to hear, pulling his desires from his expression, from the small details he didn't realize he revealed. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for his glass, too focused on her voice to notice John Jr. moving silently behind the curtain. The trapdoor beneath William's chair creaked faintly, but Kate's voice covered the sound like silk over steel. Later that night, William Stenson vanished. Days passed before anyone noticed his absence, and when they did, his disappearance joined a growing list of unanswered questions whispered between strangers. A preacher's horse had returned to town without its rider. A family of 3 never arrived at their destination. A trapper, known for his skill and strength, was said to have vanished somewhere between Parsons and Cherryvale. The prairie was swallowing people whole. In town, the sheriff began hearing the same names over and over again. Friends came searching for loved ones who had never arrived. Letters were sent, inquiries made, but no answers came. It was as though the earth itself had opened and consumed them. One evening at a small tavern in Independence, a group of men sat huddled over whiskey and fear. Their voices were low, but their faces were tense, their hands restless against the table. They were last seen near the Bender's place. one man said, his voice edged with unease. Hell, everyone passes. The Bender's place, another replied. Doesn't mean they're killers. Then where are they? The first man shot back. Where are any of them? No one had an answer. Back at the inn, Kate had noticed the shift. Fewer travelers stopped by, and those who did arrived wary and suspicious. She could feel it in the way they glanced at the corners of the room, in the way they asked about other guests, in the hesitations before accepting her wine. Kate adjusted. Her readings became softer, more intimate, her tone shifting to match whatever her guests needed. Most, comfort, reassurance, even warnings of vague dangers on the road ahead. Sometimes she pretended to sense death following them, making them desperate for her guidance, eager to stay where they felt safe, always safe. But beneath the calm surface, tension was growing within the family. Pa Bender's temper worsened. He slammed doors, cursed under his breath, and grew impatient when Kate took too long with a guest. John Jr. became careless, his laughter too loud, his steps too heavy behind the curtain. Ma Bender whispered constantly to Kate, her voice low, but sharp, reminding her that the family's survival depended on her control. You need to keep them calm, Ma hissed one night while scrubbing faint bloodstains from the floorboards. One wrong word and they'll start asking questions. Kate didn't reply. She knew the danger. The whispers in town were getting louder. One cold, windless night, a man named George Newton arrived at the inn. Unlike most travelers, he asked questions, too many of them. He wanted to know about the disappearances, about missing wagons and unclaimed belongings. He stared at the wooden table longer than anyone else ever had, running his hand along its smooth surface, feeling the faint seams of the hidden trapdoor beneath. Kate smiled, pretending not to notice his suspicion, but inside, her pulse quickened. She shifted her tone, steering the conversation away from danger and back into the familiar rhythm of her psychic readings. Her words softened, her eyes locked onto his, her voice threading into his thoughts like smoke curling around a flame. But George Newton didn't drink the wine. Kate sensed it instantly. Her smile faltered for just a heartbeat, a rare crack in her perfect mask. That night, George left before the trap could spring. After he rode away, the Benders gathered in the back room, their voices low but sharp. He'll talk, Pa growled, his massive hands tightening into fists. We should have done it anyway. No, Kate snapped, her voice colder than usual. Killing a man who's already suspicious will only bring more trouble. For a moment, silence fell between them, broken only by the wind against the windows. The family understood what was unspoken. Danger was closing in. In the following weeks, fewer travelers stopped at the inn. The ones who did often came armed, their pistols resting close to their hands, their eyes sharp and alert. Kate adjusted her strategies yet again, leaning harder into her role as the innocent, welcoming hostess, while John Jr. and Pa Bender bided their time in the shadows, waiting for the perfect opportunities. But the locals had started watching. One day. The sheriff rode past the inn under the guise of routine patrol. He tipped his hat at Kate, his polite smile failing to hide his careful eyes. He noticed the freshly turned earth behind the property, the strange, uneven mounds, and the faint metallic smell carried on the prairie wind. That night, Kate stood by the window, watching the sheriff disappear into the distance. Her reflection stared back at her in the glass, pale and sharp-edged in the lamplight. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel the cold edge of fear cutting through her calm exterior. Still, she whispered to herself, "We're safe. No one knows." But deep down, she sensed the inevitable. The inn's silence had grown heavier. Every creak of the floorboard seemed louder now, every footstep sharper. Even the prairie wind, once a soft companion to their rituals, now sounded like whispers of warning rushing through the tall grass. The Benders continued their work, but the shadow of discovery loomed over them. Each time a traveler sat at their table, Kate's hands felt just a little colder. Each time the trapdoor opened, the sound seemed louder, as though the earth itself was listening. And somewhere, beyond the endless stretch of prairie, men were gathering. Families of the missing, sheriffs from nearby towns, and ranchers who had heard too many stories were preparing to ride. They didn't have proof yet, but they had questions, and they were coming. For now, though, the inn remained warm. The fire burned low, and Kate Bender smiled softly across the table at her next guest, her voice wrapping around him like silk. "Stay the night," she whispered. "You'll be safe here. Safe. Always safe." The prairie nights were colder now. The wind swept low across the grasslands, carrying with it something heavier than dust, the weight of dread. By spring of 1849, the roads west had become quieter than ever. Wagons slowed when they neared Labette County. Riders avoided the narrow paths, lined with tall grass and whispering shadows. No one said it aloud, but everyone knew. Something was wrong near the Bender Inn. Inside, Kate Bender moved, like a phantom through the dimly lit room. Her fingers brushed lightly over the wooden table as she set it for another guest, placing each plate with meticulous care, as though perfection itself could shield them from suspicion. Across the room, Ma Bender stirred a pot over the fire, her face expressionless beneath the hooded shadows. John Jr. sat sharpening the blade of his axe, his slow, rhythmic strokes slicing through the silence. The family barely spoke anymore. Words had become dangerous things. The disappearances were no longer quiet rumors whispered in back rooms. They had become talk in the open, in taverns, on porches, at church gatherings where frightened families clutched each other and asked the same questions over and over again. Where was the preacher? Where was the prospector? Where was the family with the child who vanished somewhere along the trail? Each name hung in the air like ghosts, refusing to rest. The sheriff of Labette County, a man named Elias Rogers, had grown restless. He rode the trails himself now, questioning ranchers, stagecoach drivers, and other travelers. The stories were all different, but one detail remained constant. The last place most of the missing had been seen was near the Bender Inn. That was enough to keep him circling closer. Kate knew it. One evening, she watched from the window as the sheriff rode past. For the third time in a week, his silhouette sharp against the dying light. She tracked him with her eyes until he vanished into the distance, but even after he was gone, she kept staring, her reflection faintly visible in the glass. Her expression never changed, but inside, she felt the walls closing in. She turned back to the table, where a man named Daniel McCall sat sipping his wine. His dusty boots stretched toward the fire. He was young, maybe 25, with restless eyes that shifted between Kate and the curtains near the back wall. "You seem uneasy," Kate said softly, her voice wrapping around him like silk. Daniel shrugged. "Just heard things is all." Kate tilted her head, her gaze steady, her tone soothing. "People talk, Mr. McCall, but the prairie swallows many travelers, storms, bandits, sickness. There are countless dangers out there." He hesitated, caught between reason and instinct. Kate leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice until it was almost a whisper. "You're safe here. Safe. Always safe." But Daniel McCall never made it to his destination. By the following week, 2 more names had been added to the growing list of the missing. The townsfolk were no longer whispering. They were demanding answers. At the small Independence Tavern, voices clashed over drinks and desperation. They were last seen at the Bender's place, one man insisted, slamming his fist against the bar. "That family's odd, sure," another replied, his tone sharp with frustration. But that doesn't make them killers. Then where are they? The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswerable. While the town argued, Sheriff Rogers began his quiet investigation. He sent riders out to map the disappearances, marking each name and date on a rough sheet of parchment. When the ink dried, the pattern was unmistakable, a widening circle with the Bender Inn at its center. Still, Rogers knew suspicion wasn't enough. He needed proof. So he watched. From the ridges beyond the prairie, he studied the inn, its faint glow spilling into the darkness at night, the shadows moving inside like actors playing roles. He noted the freshly turned soil behind the house, the smoke curling thick from the chimney, the unusual quiet whenever travelers stopped by. But what he couldn't see was the ritual unfolding beneath the surface. Inside, Kate's work had become more deliberate. She no longer rushed her readings. She made them deeper, weaving entire stories from fragments of her guests' lives. Her words painted futures they longed for, fears they couldn't escape, visions they needed to believe. And while her voice carried them away, John Jr. and Pa Bender waited, silent behind the curtain, axes in hand. The killings continued, but the fear of discovery sharpened every movement, every sound, every breath. One night, when the wind howled outside and rain beat against the windows, the family gathered in the back room after another body had been dragged through the trapdoor. The single oil lamp flickered weakly, throwing jagged shadows across the walls. Pa Bender's voice was low but hard. "It's too dangerous now," he said, wiping blood from his hands. "They're watching us." John Jr. leaned back against the wall, his laughter quick and sharp, cutting through the tension. "Let them watch," he said. "No one believes their own suspicions until they see the truth with their own eyes." Ma Bender's face was unreadable, her voice colder than the wind outside. "The sheriff rides past too often. Kate, you need to be more careful." Kate stood silent for a moment, her hands folded neatly before her, her face calm. Finally, she spoke, her tone soft but edged with steel. "Then we make them trust us even more," she said. "If suspicion grows, we bury it with charm and kindness. The sheriff, the townsfolk, even the travelers, they'll believe us innocent until the very last moment." Her plan worked. For a time. Kate invited the sheriff himself to the inn one evening, smiling warmly as she poured him tea instead of wine. She spoke of faith, safety, and family, while Pa Bender played the role of the gruff but harmless host. Rogers stayed for less than an hour, but when he left, his doubts had deepened rather than vanished. He had noticed the table, not the trapdoor, not yet, but the grooves in the wood beneath, where guests always sat. He had noticed the faint, uneven mounds of earth behind the inn, as though the land itself was swallowing secrets. He didn't have proof, but his instincts whispered warnings he couldn't ignore. He returned to town with his suspicions, and by morning, rumors flared like wildfire. The Benders' smiles were no longer enough to calm the growing unrest. Farmers began riding armed along the roads, their rifles resting across their laps. Travelers carried knives, keeping one hand near the hilt as they passed through Labette County. For the first time, people started avoiding the inn entirely. Kate noticed it immediately. The sound of an empty road was louder than any scream she'd ever heard. Fewer guests meant fewer opportunities, and fewer opportunities meant desperation was creeping in like rot beneath the floorboards. John Jr. grew restless, pacing at night, muttering about taking bigger risks. Pa Bender sharpened his axe until the blade shone white in the firelight. Ma Bender sat quietly, sewing beneath the dim lamplight, her silence more unsettling than words. Kate watched them all, her mind racing. She had built their ritual on control, on precision, on perfection. But now, control was slipping through her fingers. One night, as the wind howled through the prairie grass and the fire burned low, Kate stood at the window, staring into the dark horizon. She could feel it in her bones. Something was coming, something inevitable. The silence was breaking, and when it did, the prairie would give up its secrets, one shallow grave at a time. The prairie was restless that night. The tall grass swayed under a cold wind, and somewhere in the distance, a lone wolf howled into the emptiness. Inside the Bender Inn, the air was thick with the familiar weight of ritual. But something was different. The guest tonight was a man named Charles Thompson, a ranch hand traveling north to visit his brother. He was wiry, quiet, and observant, the kind of man who noticed the smallest details without ever seeming to. From the moment he stepped inside, Kate studied him carefully, her practiced smile never faltering. He didn't remove his coat. He didn't drink the wine she poured. And most importantly, his eyes never left hers, not even when the fire popped loudly or John Jr. shifted behind the curtain. "You seem guarded," Kate whispered softly, tilting her head as though she could see inside his thoughts. "Just cautious," he replied, his voice low but steady. "Been hearing stories." Kate's smile widened, warm and inviting, masking the faint tightening of her jaw. "Stories can be dangerous things, Mr. Thompson. Out here, the prairie swallows many travelers. People talk. They weave tales when they don't understand the truth." He nodded, but his hand rested lightly on the handle of his knife. Dinner passed in tense silence. Kate spoke little, sensing that too many words would only deepen his suspicion. John Jr. paced behind the curtain, his breathing sharp, eager for the signal. Pa Bender leaned against the wall, his axe resting against his leg, his impatience radiating like heat. But Kate hesitated. Something about Charles Thompson unsettled her. His gaze was steady, too steady. He wasn't drinking, wasn't relaxing, wasn't giving her the tiny openings she usually exploited. When she leaned forward to reach for his hand, her signature gesture. His fingers brushed against the table beneath him and he felt it, the seam of the trapdoor. His eyes flicked downward for only a heartbeat, but Kate saw it. Their gazes locked, predator and prey, and for the first time she wasn't sure who was which. She smiled sweetly, masking the storm rising inside her. "You must be tired from your travels," she whispered. "Why not stay the night?" But Charles Thompson didn't answer. Instead, he stood slowly, his boots scuffing against the worn wooden floor. "I think I'll push on," he said, his voice calm but edged with steel. John Jr. stepped forward from behind the curtain, the axe glinting faintly in the firelight. "Roads ain't safe at night," he said, his tone cold and deliberate. Charles's hand tightened on the handle of his knife. For a moment the room was silent, thick with unspoken violence. Kate's heart pounded, though her face remained serene. She knew one wrong move would shatter the fragile balance. Then Charles Thompson did something no other guest had ever done. He turned his back to them and walked toward the door, slowly, steadily, without running. His every step was deliberate, calculated, his breathing measured. Pa Bender shifted his weight, ready to strike. Kate's fingers twitched on the edge of the table. John Jr. raised the axe slightly. And then Charles wrenched the door open and stepped into the cold prairie night, disappearing into the darkness before any of them could move. For the first time, a guest had escaped. The silence that followed was suffocating. Pa Bender slammed his fist against the wall, his roar rattling the windows. "He'll tell them," he bellowed. "He'll bring them all here." Kate's voice was sharp, cutting through his fury. "If we chase him, we prove everything. We do nothing. We wait." But deep down, she knew the inevitable had begun. Next morning, Charles Thompson rode straight into Independence and went straight to Sheriff Elias Rogers. He told him everything. The odd tension, the strange positioning of the chair, the faint seam of the trapdoor, and the cold edge of John Jr.'s axe. For Rogers, it was the first real clue he'd been waiting for. Within hours, He gathered a small group of armed men, townsfolk, ranchers, and other travelers who had lost friends and family along the prairie road. They rode south toward Labette County, the weight of justice hanging in the air like a storm ready to break. Back at the inn, Kate sensed the change in the wind before she even heard the distant sound of hooves. She stood by the window, her reflection pale in the morning light, and whispered softly to herself, "It's happening." The family gathered in the back room, their voices sharp and urgent. "They'll be here," Pa said, his jaw clenched tight. "We have to prepare." John Jr. slammed the axe into the wooden beam, splinters flying. "Then we kill them when they come." "No," Kate snapped, her voice colder than ever. "We don't fight them. Not yet. If they find nothing, they leave. We stay calm. We act innocent." Ma Bender sat in silence, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her face pale but unreadable. Hours passed like slow, grinding stones until finally the sheriff's riders appeared on the horizon. 6 men, rifles resting across their saddles, their faces hard with suspicion. Kate opened the door before they could knock, her softest smile in place, her tone sweet as honey. "Sheriff Rogers," she said, as though greeting an old friend. "What brings you to our home?" Rogers tipped his hat but didn't return the smile. His sharp eyes scanned the room behind her, the table, the curtains, the floor. "Just checking in, Miss Bender," he said evenly. "We've had concerns." Kate laughed lightly, her voice smooth and unshaken. "Concerns? Oh, Sheriff, the prairie's full of dangers. We keep a careful eye on travelers, but surely you don't think—" Her words trailed off deliberately, letting the weight of innocence settle between them. Rogers didn't reply. He stepped inside, his boots heavy against the wood, the other men following behind. His gaze lingered on the table, then the chair, then the faint, uneven marks around the seams of the trapdoor. "Mind if I look around?" he asked. "Of course not," Kate replied, stepping aside with a graceful wave of her hand. For nearly an hour, Rogers and his men searched the inn. They lifted floorboards, opened cupboards, even checked behind the curtains. But they found nothing. The trapdoor was sealed tight, the bodies buried deep enough that the earth gave no sign of its secrets. When the sheriff finally left, his suspicions remained, but his proof was still out of reach. That night, Kate sat alone by the window, staring out at the dark prairie. The wind whispered through the grass like 1,000 voices, and for the first time, her hands trembled faintly in her lap. The Benders weren't safe anymore. Not from the sheriff, not from the townsfolk, not from the ghosts of the missing whose silence was beginning to scream, and somewhere deep inside her, Kate knew the truth she could never say aloud. The prairie would not keep their secrets much longer. The sun hung low over the Kansas prairie, burning orange against a restless horizon. A dry wind swept across the tall grass, carrying with it whispers from the earth, whispers of things buried and secrets long kept. In Independence, the air was tense, heavy with rumor and unease. Charles Thompson's story had spread like wildfire. By dusk, every saloon, trading post, and church was murmuring about the strange family living on the edge of the prairie road. The name Bender had become something else now, something darker. Sheriff Elias Rogers stood outside the town hall as the crowd grew larger by the hour. Farmers, ranch hands, widows, and shopkeepers gathered in tight clusters, their faces pale, their voices sharp with anger and fear. "They've been killing people out there," one man growled, his fists clenched. "My brother disappeared near that inn 6 months ago." "They're burying him," a woman whispered, her voice cracking. "Out there in the fields. God help us." Rogers raised his hands to quiet them, his voice steady but urgent. "We don't know the full truth yet. We'll find out. But we're going to do this right. No mob justice, no mistakes." But the crowd's silence was thin, fragile, like a thread ready to snap. By nightfall, a group of 20 armed men rode south toward Labette County. They carried rifles slung over their shoulders, lanterns tied to their saddles, and the weight of vengeance pressing heavy on their hearts. Rogers led them, his jaw set, his hand resting on the worn handle of his revolver. The prairie stretched endless before them, an ocean of grass glowing faintly beneath the moonlight. Coyotes howled somewhere in the distance, their cries slicing through the night like broken prayers. Inside the Bender Inn, Kate sat at the table, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The fire crackled weakly, its glow throwing jagged shadows across the wooden walls. Pa Bender sharpened his axe with slow, deliberate strokes, the rhythmic scrape filling the silence. "They're coming," Kate whispered, her voice barely audible. John, Jr. paced the length of the room, his fingers twitching, his breathing ragged. "Then we fight. We fight and we don't stop." Ma Bender, silent as ever, sat in the corner, rocking slowly in her chair, her lips moving faintly, muttering prayers in German no one else understood. Kate's eyes never left the window. In the reflection, her face looked pale, hollow, ghost-like. "No," she said softly. "We don't fight. We prepare." Far across the prairie, the search party reached the outskirts of the Bender property just as midnight approached. The men dismounted quietly, tying their horses to the fence posts. Rogers raised a hand, signaling silence. The inn stood alone against the horizon, its silhouette dark and unwelcoming beneath the pale moonlight. No smoke rose from the chimney. No lamplight glowed in the windows. It was too quiet. Rogers motioned for two men to circle behind the house, while he and the others approached the front door. He knocked once, hard, his knuckles striking the wood like a drumbeat. No answer. He knocked again, louder this time, the echo rolling through the silence like distant thunder. Still nothing. With a glance to the others, Rogers reached for the handle and found it unlocked. The door creaked open slowly, revealing the dark interior of the inn. The fire was dead, the table cleared, the curtains open to the pale light of the moon. The air was thick with the lingering smell of smoke, sweat, and something faintly metallic beneath it. Blood. Rogers stepped inside cautiously, his boots silent against the wooden floor. The men followed, lanterns raised, their shadows stretching, long and sharp across the walls. The inn was empty. They searched every corner, every cupboard, every room. The beds were stripped bare. The shelves were cleared. Every trace of the Bender family was gone. But then one of the men called out softly from behind the curtain. "Sheriff, you'd better see this." Rogers stepped around the table and stopped, dead. The trapdoor. It was small, barely wide enough for a man to fit through, and its edges were worn smooth, as though opened and closed countless times. The sheriff crouched, running his fingers along the seams, his chest tightening with a cold certainty. "Open it," he ordered quietly. Two men pried it up, the wood groaning loudly as it gave way. A rush of damp, stale air rose from below, carrying with it a smell that made the men gag and stumble back. A smell thick with rot and decay. Lantern light spilled into the dark cellar beneath. The earthen walls glistened faintly with moisture, and the ground was stained dark in places where no soil should have been. It wasn't just a cellar. It was a slaughterhouse, but there were no bodies. Rogers' jaw clenched as he stood, his voice low and sharp. "They're gone. They knew we were coming." The men spread out across the property, lanterns swinging in the dark, searching for any sign of the family. Behind the barn, one of the ranchers stopped suddenly, his breath catching in his throat. "Sheriff," he whispered hoarsely. "Over here." Rogers approached, his boots sinking into the damp earth, and followed the man's trembling hand toward a patch of uneven soil beneath an old oak tree. The grass there was darker, wet with dew, and something else. He knelt, pressing his palm against the ground. It was soft, freshly turned. "Dig," he ordered. The men worked in silence, their shovels slicing into the earth under the cold light of the moon. Minutes stretched into an eternity until, at last, one of them struck something. Solid. The sound was hollow, sickening. The sheriff knelt beside the hole and brushed away the loose dirt with his hands until the outline became clear. A skull. Cracked, weathered, but unmistakable. The men froze, their breath coming in ragged gasps. Rogers stood slowly, his lantern casting a faint glow over the field. His voice was steady, but heavy with dread. "Mark this spot," he said softly, "and every patch like it. We'll dig them all." By dawn, they had uncovered 3 graves. Inside lay fragments of bone, bits of torn fabric and rusted buckles from boots and belts. But there were no full bodies, not yet. When the sun finally rose over the prairie, it bathed the Bender property in pale, ghostly light. The once quiet inn now looked like a scar carved into the land, its secrets bleeding slowly into the morning. The sheriff turned back toward the house, his voice low but firm. "They ran because they're guilty, and we're gonna find them." Far beyond the fields, deep in the shadowed woods, Kate Bender paused at the edge of a creek, her skirt soaked with mud, her breath ragged from the long night's escape. She turned back once, just once, and watched the distant glow of lanterns flicker faintly against the horizon. Her face was pale, unreadable, but her lips moved silently as if speaking to the wind. "They'll never catch us," she whispered, and then she disappeared into the trees. The prairie was no longer quiet. By sunrise, the story had reached every corner of Kansas. The discovery of the trapdoor, the stench rising from the cellar, the fragments of bone unearthed beneath the oak trees. Rumors spread like fire in a dry wind, twisting into something darker with each retelling. By noon, Independence was overflowing, with strangers, bounty hunters, ranchers, railroad men, and drifters carrying rifles slung across their backs and hunger in their eyes. Every saloon echoed with the same words, "The Benders." Sheriff Elias Rogers stood on the wooden steps of the town hall, his voice cutting above the restless crowd. "Listen to me," he barked. "This is not a game, and this isn't a hunt for glory. We are bringing them in alive if we can, dead if we must, but we do this right, understand?" Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Among them were men who had lost brothers, fathers, wives. Others came for the reward, $3,000 in gold, promised by the governor to anyone who captured the Benders. By the time Rogers mounted his horse, more than 50 armed riders followed him south, their silhouettes long against the afternoon sun. Dust rose behind them like a storm cloud, and the prairie echoed with the thunder of hooves. But the Benders were already gone. Deep within the tangled woods miles from their abandoned inn, Kate sat beneath the twisted roots of a fallen oak, her skirts torn and her boots caked with mud. Pa Bender stood watch nearby, his axe in hand, while Ma sat silently against the trunk, rocking faintly as if cradling something unseen. John Jr. paced in frantic circles, muttering under his breath, his eyes darting at every sound. "They're coming, Katie," he hissed. "I hear them. They're close." Kate's gaze was distant, her breathing slow, her voice almost too soft to hear. "No," she murmured. "Not yet. We have time." But she didn't believe her own words. Her fingers trembled as she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small pendant, a piece of black glass wrapped in silver wire. She pressed it against her lips, whispering fragments of old charms and prayers, words she claimed could bend fate itself. "The earth hides us," she breathed. "The wind carries us. The shadows protect us." But even as she spoke the words, a distant sound cut through the trees, the sharp crack of a rifle far away, carried on the wind. The hunt had begun. Back at the inn, Rogers and his men worked through the property like wolves on a scent. They dug shallow graves, marked burial spots with wooden stakes, and catalogued what they found. By dusk they had uncovered 6 full bodies, all men, all missing travelers, whose names were written in faded ink on posters pinned to the sheriff's office wall. Each corpse had the same wound, a crushing blow to the skull just behind the right ear. "This was no robbery," Rogers said grimly, wiping the sweat from his brow. "This was slaughter." The newspapers seized on the story within hours. By the following morning, headlines screamed across Kansas: "The Bloody Benders, Psychic Murderess Haunts the Plains, Kansas Butchers Vanish into the Wilderness." Fear consumed the towns along the Prairie Road. Inns emptied overnight. Families locked their doors. Travelers avoided the region entirely. The name Bender became a curse whispered under breath, a symbol of evil hiding in plain sight. Sheriff Rogers knew time was against him. Every hour the Benders stayed free, they slipped deeper into the wild, closer to safety. He gathered 36 men, the strongest riders, the sharpest trackers, and set out at first light. Their search led them south along the river, where footprints trailed through the mud, faint but distinct. Rogers crouched over the marks, his jaw tightening. 4 of them, he muttered, still together. The men followed the tracks for miles through shifting terrain, across fields, through dense patches of woods, and into rocky gullies, where the ground turned treacherous and uneven. At times they lost the trail entirely, only to find it again where broken branches and disturbed soil betrayed the fugitives' path. But the Benders knew the land. Each night they doubled back on their tracks, crossed streams to mask their scent, and hid beneath natural rock shelters. Kate kept them moving, her uncanny sense of direction guiding them through the labyrinth of wilderness, as though she could see paths no one else could. On the 4th night, as the family huddled near a cold campfire, Pa Bender finally broke the silence. "We can't run forever," he growled, his accent thick and guttural. "We kill anyone who comes close. We disappear for good." Kate stared into the dying embers, her expression unreadable. "No," she said quietly. "We don't fight them. Not yet. Fighting leaves bodies, bodies leave trails, we become ghosts, we leave nothing behind." But even as she spoke, her control was slipping. The voices had grown louder. At night, when the wind howled through the trees, she swore she could hear the screams of the dead, the travelers who never left the inn, their silent accusations chasing her through the darkness. She woke in cold sweats, her dreams filled with visions of shallow graves and rotting hands clawing through the earth. John Jr. was unraveling faster. He muttered constantly, his laughter sharp and broken like glass splintering in the dark. Sometimes he disappeared into the woods for hours, returning with dirt beneath his nails and blood on his shirt. When Kate confronted him, he only smiled. "They're close," he whispered one night, his eyes wide and wild. "I can smell them." By the 7th day of the manhunt, Rogers' riders reached the edge of the Neosho River. There they found the first real clue, a discarded bonnet tangled in the reeds, soaked with rain and streaked with mud. "It's hers," Rogers said flatly, recognizing the delicate stitching from the inn. "We're closing in." The men camped by the river, setting sentries at every edge, lanterns glowing faintly against the black water. The prairie at night was alive with sound, frogs croaking, insects humming, coyotes calling from the distance. But beneath it all, an unnatural stillness lingered, as though the land itself was holding its breath. Across the river, hidden in the trees, Kate watched them from the shadows. Her breath came slow and quiet, her pale face barely visible beneath her hood. Pa stood behind her, silent as stone, while Ma clutched her pendant tightly, muttering frantic prayers. John Jr. crouched low, his hand resting on the handle of his knife, his grin sharp and hungry. "They're right there," he whispered. "Just across the water. We could end this." Kate shook her head slowly, her voice a whisper carried only to her family. No, not tonight. We wait. We move at dawn. The sheriff's campfire burned low as midnight passed, the riders sleeping in uneasy shifts. Somewhere in the darkness, a twig snapped, a ripple of sound stirred through the woods. Kate turned away from the riverbank, her whisper almost lost to the wind. "They think they're hunting us," she said softly. "But they don't know the shadows belong to me." The Benders vanished deeper into the wilderness once more, leaving nothing but silence behind them. But Rogers felt it in his bones as he stood by the river at dawn, scanning the empty horizon. The hunt wasn't ending, it was only just beginning. The storm came without warning. By dusk, the sky had turned black, thunder rolling low and deep across the Kansas prairie. Rain hammered the earth, drumming against the leaves and pounding the riverbanks into mud. Lightning tore open the horizon, lighting up the endless expanse of wilderness where the Bender family moved like shadows between the trees. Kate led them through the downpour, her hood pulled low, her steps silent and deliberate. Pa followed close behind, his axe clutched tightly in his hands, his boots sinking into the sodden earth. Ma stumbled through the rain, whispering her endless German prayers beneath her breath, while John Jr. trailed at the back, muttering to himself and laughing softly at nothing. The storm masked their movements, but Kate knew it couldn't hide them forever. She could feel it, the hunt pressing against her spine, the weight of unseen eyes tracking them through the darkness. Behind them, Sheriff Elias Rogers and his riders followed relentless as wolves. Their lanterns burned faintly in the rain, swinging wildly with every stride of their horses. The storm slowed them, but it did not stop them. Rogers' jaw was tight, his hat dripping with water, his revolver strapped tight to his side. "There, close," he said to the men beside him, his voice rough against the roar of the rain. "I can feel it." The Benders had evaded him for nearly 2 weeks. They'd slipped through creeks, doubled back on trails, and vanished into gullies so deep that sunlight never reached them. But Rogers had something now he didn't have before: desperation. The governor's reward had brought more men, better trackers, and sharper hunters. The Benders were running out of land. By midnight, Kate stopped suddenly at the edge of a ridge, her breath fogging in the cold air. Below, the prairie stretched wide and endless, broken only by the winding river that marked the southern border. Beyond that river was freedom, Indian territory where the law would not follow. John Jr. saw it too and let out a sharp, broken laugh. There, we're almost out. But Kate didn't move. Her pale face glimmered faintly in the stormlight, her expression unreadable. "They're already here," she whispered. A distant crack split the night, a rifle shot. The bullet tore through the branches above their heads, showering them in wet leaves and splintered bark. "Go," Kate hissed, shoving Ma forward. "Move." The family scattered into the trees as Rogers' riders broke through the darkness, their shouts rising above the storm. Muzzle flashes lit the woods in bursts of fire, thunder answering each shot, as if the heavens themselves were furious. Kate grabbed John Jr.'s arm, dragging him behind a fallen log as bullets tore through the rain. Pa swung his axe blindly toward the shadows, roaring curses into the night, but Rogers was closing in. Through the sheets of rain, Kate saw him, his lantern glowing faintly, his revolver raised, his dark coat plastered against his body. His face was carved from stone, his eyes locked on her like a hawk descending on prey. "Kate Bender," he shouted over the storm, his voice cutting like steel. "It ends tonight." She stared back at him, her chest rising and falling with sharp, ragged breaths. "No," she whispered, her voice calm despite the chaos. "Tonight it begins." Then she vanished into the trees. The hunt twisted deeper into the wilderness. Lanterns bobbed like restless ghosts among the trees. the thunder swallowing shouts and gunfire alike. Rogers split his men into two groups, circling the ridge to drive the benders toward the riverbank. Kate led her family through the dark like she could see paths no one else could, weaving between gnarled roots and jagged rocks, as if the forest itself whispered directions to her. But her control was slipping. Her mind burned with visions she couldn't silence, visions of pale faces rising from shallow graves, mouths open in silent screams. They reached the river's edge just as lightning ripped across the sky, illuminating the black water below. The current was high, wild with rain, churning against the rocks like a living thing. Kate turned to her family, her voice low and sharp. "We cross. Now." John Jr. shook his head violently, panic in his eyes. "The water'll take us. It'll kill us." "Better the river than the rope," Pa growled, shoving him forward. They stepped into the current, the icy water biting at their legs, pulling hard against their weight. The roar of the river drowned the world, until another sound rose above it, a single gunshot. Pa Bender's body jerked violently, his axe slipping from his hands and vanishing into the water. He stumbled forward, collapsing into the current, without a sound. Ma screamed, her voice tearing through the storm, but the river swallowed him whole, dragging him beneath the surface before anyone could reach him. Kate froze, her chest heaving, her mind numb. But Roger's voice came from behind them, closer now, carried over the roar of the river. "Kate, stop running." She turned slowly, rain streaking down her pale face, her eyes wide and glassy in the stormlight. Behind Rogers, more riders emerged. From the trees, rifles raised, lanterns swinging wildly. They were surrounded. John Jr. snarled like a trapped animal, pulling the knife from his belt. "I'll kill every one of you," he screamed, lunging forward, but Roger's revolver cracked once, twice, and John fell hard into the mud, his laughter dying on his lips. Ma Bender dropped to her knees, clutching at the wet earth, her hands shaking violently. Her prayers had dissolved into broken sobs, her voice lost beneath the storm. Kate stood alone now, the river raging at her back, the riders closing in, their rifles glinting in the lightning. She raised her hands slowly, her voice calm, almost soft, though her words cut like glass. "You think you've won," she whispered, "but you don't know what's buried here. You don't know how many. You don't know what I see when I close my eyes." Rogers took a step closer, his revolver steady. "It's over, Kate." She smiled faintly, her lips trembling, her voice barely a breath. "No," she said. "Not for me." And before he could react, she turned and stepped backward into the river. The current seized her instantly, pulling her beneath the black surface, swallowing her into the storm. Rogers lunged forward, shouting her name, but the river was merciless, and the night consumed her without a trace. By dawn, the storm had passed. The searchers scoured the riverbanks for hours, but there was no sign of Kate's body. Ma Bender was taken into custody, silent and unblinking, her prayers now nothing but dry whispers. John Jr.'s corpse was buried beneath a lone oak tree, on the edge of the prairie, marked only by a wooden cross carved hastily by Rogers himself. Pa was never found. Kate was never found, but the land remembered. Weeks later, the townsfolk returned to the inn. The sheriff ordered the cellar filled, the floors sealed, the graves marked and blessed. But travelers still whispered that at night, when the wind blew across the prairie, you could hear her voice in the tall grass, soft and cold as the grave. Some said Kate drowned that night. Others said she crossed the river and vanished into the wilderness, taking her secrets with her. But Rogers knew better. He'd seen her eyes in the storm, seen the strange calm behind them. She hadn't drowned. She had escaped. And somewhere out there, beyond the reach of the law, the prairie still belonged to Kate Bender.